Good morning or good afternoon from wherever you may be joining today. And welcome to our third webinar of the series on access to remedy, which is being co-hosted by the Social and Economic Council of the Netherlands and the Initiative for Global Solidarity, a German development cooperation project implemented by GIZ. My name is Mora. I am the technical advisor responsible for the area of grievance mechanisms within the Initiative for Global Solidarity, and I will be once again today your moderator. As I have done in the past 2 times, I would like to take a short time to thank already in advance my partners in this endeavor, Seljan Verlieva-Smits and Luz Jacobs. Jointly with our speakers, we have prepared the session and we hope that it will fulfill your expectations. Useful. We started the series with the aim to provide a platform for industry stakeholders to exchange on experiences and to be able to identify synergies among each other and promote peer-to-peer learning in the broad area of remedy and grievance mechanisms. We would like to highlight that we don't necessarily promote the best practices. We promote practices of what is being done on the ground in the area of remedy and grievance mechanisms. If we end up providing you with a couple of golden nuggets or useful information which you may encounter while listening to the webinars, then we have accomplished our goal. For today's session, we delve into a critical topic at the intersection of corporate responsibility, human rights, and global supply chains, integrating worker voices into remedy and grievance mechanisms in global supply chains. This discussion is of paramount importance, especially in an era marked by heightened awareness of labor rights, social justice, and ethical sourcing practices. The globalization of supply chains has transformed the way products are manufactured, distributed, and consumed. While this has brought economic benefits, it has also exposed numerous challenges, particularly concerning the rights and well-being of workers in the lower tiers of these intricate networks. Worker exploitation, unsafe conditions, and inadequate compensation persist in far too many instances. In response to these challenges, the concept of human rights due diligence has emerged as a vital framework for businesses to ensure they respect human rights throughout their operations, including within their supply chains. So central to HRDD is the need to incorporate worker voices into remedy and grievance mechanisms effectively. It is not enough to have policies on paper. The lived experiences and insights of workers themselves must be at the core of any meaningful human rights effort. Moreover, with the increasing adoption of mandatory HRDD laws in several jurisdictions, the legal imperative for companies to act responsibly and uphold worker voices in the supply chain is becoming even more pronounced. If we zoom into international framework documents on business and human rights, we can see that the logic of grievance mechanisms and remedy are built on the assumption of rights holders being able to give feedback and raise grievances, thus making the right holder the center of the endeavor. For example, if we take a look at the United Nations Guiding Principles and Principle 31 on the effectiveness criteria of grievance mechanisms, the involvement of rights holders is key in implementing these criteria by involving affected stakeholder groups in the design and implementation of said grievance mechanisms. Moreover, the OECD guidelines on multinational enterprises calls on companies to communicate with worker representatives and trade unions through meaningful engagement. We also know from mandatory due diligence laws that the inclusion of affected stakeholders is expected. The EU Directive on Corporate Sustainability aims to emphasize the roles of trade unions, legitimate worker representatives, and civil society organizations. However, in practice, effective and meaningful stakeholder engagement can be challenging and complex. We may have international documents, law to back up the theory, but how does reality look like? How can companies really integrate worker voices in global supply chains? Today, we are fortunate to have 2 distinguished guests who have been at the forefront of advancing worker rights and shaping the way companies approach these critical issues. We have today with us Electronics Watch, an international NGO renowned for its innovative and worker-driven monitoring approach. Electronics Watch has pioneered methods that empower workers to actively participate in monitoring the conditions of their workplaces, ensuring their voices are not only heard, but also heeded. We have also with us IndustriAll, a global union federation with a rich history of negotiating global framework agreements between trade unions and multinational companies. IndustriAll has played a pivotal role in bridging the gap between corporations and the workers they employ, forging pathways to address grievances and uphold labor rights. Today's discussion will explore the practical strategies and collaborative efforts needed to integrate worker voices into HREDD, fostering a workplace environment where transparency, accountability, and respect for human rights are not just ideals, but tangible realities. We will examine the role of trade unions and local NGOs in championing worker voices, the challenges they face, and the successes they have achieved. Our aim is to provide valuable insights and guidance for companies seeking to navigate the complexities of their global supply chains while upholding the dignity and rights of workers. We hope that this dialogue will inspire meaningful action, partnerships, and commitments that drive positive changes across industries and regions. Thank you for joining us in this important conversation, and I look forward to a stimulating and productive discussion ahead. So let us begin with our first guest, Executive Director of Electronics Watch, Björn Claeson. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today, Björn. Would you care to begin by introducing yourself and the work you do at Electronics Watch?
Yes, thank you very much for inviting Electronics Watch to this important event. My name is Björn Claeson. As you said, I'm Executive Director of Electronics Watch. You said a little bit about our organization, and you highlighted the importance of worker-driven monitoring that we'll talk about a little bit further in this conversation. But I think it's important for participants to also know that we organize our work around the public procurement market. That is to say, we help public buyers to protect the rights of workers in their supply chains. When I say public buyers, I mean we are talking about 1,000 affiliated public buyers in 10 countries in Europe and also in Australia. And they represent local townships or large cities or regional governments, also national government agencies that use public funds to buy electronics. So in this work, we focus on electronics. We focus on the manufacturing stage primarily, but increasingly also on the mining stage in the electronics supply chain. And what we do with the public buyers is we provide technical support, guidance, we facilitate networking, we help to foster a common approach to promoting worker rights in their supply chains. We help them to share knowledge and experience so that overall we create a harmonized approach among public buyers, strengthening their leverage, but also facilitating the work for their suppliers. We do, as you mentioned, we also do monitor public buyer supply chains, and we do this in collaboration with civil society organizations that are local to electronics production regions. We'll talk much more about that, I believe. We are currently active in, I believe, around 11 manufacturing areas for mining areas around the world. As a final and critical part of our work, we also engage systematically with industry, with companies to drive corrective action and drive remedy. Our approach here is to have dialogue with companies within a pre-established and agreed upon framework to drive improvements. Perhaps despite our name, which has watch in it, and there are many other watches out there, we're not an advocacy, we're not a name and shame, we're not a campaign organization, but we value the opportunity for dialogue with companies.
Thank you, Björn, for accentuating the fact that you're not only engaged on the ground, integrating the worker voices, but also making it reflect as well into the remedy, right? So not just how the grievance comes in, but on the actual result and the follow-up. So thank you for that. And let's dive in. Electronics Watch emphasizes the importance of meaningful dialogue for effective remediation. So what does meaningful engagement or dialogue look like in practice? And what is the actual situation that Electronics Watch often encounters in regards to remediation? And lastly, in your opinion, what needs to change?
Okay. Yeah, so to start with, it is important to recognize, I think, that the remedy is of course an outcome that workers are searching to. Basically, we're asking the question, how do workers who have suffered harm become whole? How do we restore workers to the situation they would have been in had they not suffered a harm? That's the outcome piece, but it's critical to understand also that the remedy is also a process. And you never get to the right outcome if you don't have the process in place. And the remedy process, as I think you also articulated in the beginning, in the introduction, Maria, requires meaningful participation of the rights holders, of the workers, of those who have suffered harm, as well as participation by legitimate trade unions or other legitimate worker representatives. The process should be based upon workers' needs, or those who have suffered harm, their needs, their expectations, and their perspectives. And decisions about outcomes really should not be taken without this involvement of the workers and the legitimate worker representatives. So, is this the reality currently? I don't have a global view, right? So take it. So with the caveat that all my comments really during this discussion is based upon our experience primarily in the electronics industry, but I think that a lot of what we have learned in the electronics industry is applicable to other industries and global supply chains as well. So with that caveat, is this the current reality? I would say in the absence of having a legitimate trade unions in place, this is rarely the reality. What we see is companies may work on developing a corrective action plan. In some cases, they may be working on developing a remedy. Those are different. We can talk about that further. But in each one of those processes, workers do not have a central role. And usually legitimate trade unions and worker representatives are also not sufficiently involved. So what I mean is, so the typical process is what we refer to the audit and corrective action process. You do a social audit and you have a corrective action, and you do corrective action, you do a closure audit, and that's a oversimplification, but that's a typical process. In this process, the workers are not ignored, sure. Trade unions may be present at the opening meetings of an audit, at the closure meeting of the audit. That depends upon the system that's being used. But fundamentally, workers are treated as a source of information rather than as an active participant or an equal participant in the process. Workers typically have no say in what goes into the corrective action plan or in the remedy that's being devised. Workers typically have no access to the audit findings themselves because they are proprietary to the auditee, usually to the factory that's being audited. And I think that what we have seen in the best case scenario, we work with companies that develop a corrective action plan or develop a remedy, and then explain to workers why they have done what they have done. So that's good that they do that, but it's still not getting to the level where workers are an active participant in the process. And so what needs to change here? There are fundamental challenges in having a sound remedy process where workers are and legitimate worker representatives and trade unions are involved. I'll mention a few of those. One is, from workers' perspective, time and resources. You work in exhausting jobs, right? Maybe you have 12-hour days. Maybe you work 6 days a week. I mean, this of course varies. Maybe you don't have long commutes back and forth to your dormitory. there's no time. That you work, you cook, you go to the bathroom and you sleep, and etc. And there's no time. That's one thing. I think lack of knowledge is also another major obstacle. In other words, often workers don't know their rights. They don't know what is guaranteed to them under the law. They don't know what occupational health and safety is. If they're migrant workers, they don't know the agreements between the different countries that they're the sender country and there's the receiver country. So there's a lack of knowledge that impedes participation. And then I go back to the lack of worker access to audit findings. These are findings sometimes that uncover dangerous workplaces that workers have a right and have a need to know about. Most fundamentally, I think, is fear of retaliation. That is to say, workers are typically, I would say, this is not the exception. I think this is the norm, warned not to talk to outsiders, may even be coerced or coached not to reveal the truth about their situation to auditors. We do see this very often. Made to sign non-disclosure agreements, which they interpret as saying, okay, I can't talk about anything about my working conditions to outsiders. So this fear of retaliation, that they might lose their jobs or they might be demoted if they speak up, that impedes the very first step of this remedy process. There are no complaints because workers are afraid to complain. And then I think something else that is very important in terms of barrier that should be addressed is where, and this is not as common, of course, as this pervasive fear of retaliation that workers feel, but it is nevertheless very impactful, is when worker leaders are dismissed, or it may not be a corporate action, right? Worker leaders could, in some countries, may be arrested or subject to the harassment of state authorities, or when there's union busting taking place or discrimination against union leaders. That is really important too, and that even though that doesn't happen on a regular basis, people remember that, and that will be and that will serve to deter workers from coming forward, and that is detrimental, I think, also to the remedy process. Yeah.
Thank you for that elaborate response, Björn, and thank you for highlighting those 5 areas. To me, there's a very straightforward linkage to the work that Electronics Watch is doing, but the approach of Electronics Watch is not new to me. The Initiative for Global Solidarity and Electronics Watch are proud official collaborators in the work that Electronics Watch does. However, I think that the work that you do is quite distinct, and the audience would benefit from hearing more about your actual modus operandi, right? So how do you attempt to cover these gaps that you also mentioned? So Electronics Watch places a focus on off-site dialogue with workers assisted by local organizations, which you mentioned before. What are the benefits and the challenges of such work? And what local organizations can companies engage to help facilitate a trusted format for such a dialogue, even if they're not from the electronics sector or from other sectors?
Right. So yes, we do. Our monitoring methodology is based mostly upon off-site methods. In other words, how to reach workers outside of their place of work. However, I don't think that on-site versus off-site is the core issue. On-site approaches and off-site approaches both can work, both can fail, and I think they can be usefully combined. And I think that some companies are beginning to do that, which is a good step forward. I think that on-site audits or on-site monitoring certainly carries a lot of risks. When an auditor who approaches workers that they don't know, and maybe even relying on interpreters to talk to these workers, when the worker interviews are conducted in situations where workers of knowing that they may be overheard. The workers' interviews are very short when often auditors are under pressure to deliver results to the client on very short time. They have to guard against worker coaching. They have to guard against falsified records and so on. And sometimes, in some situations, the auditors themselves face situations that are in environments where they themselves face threats. So all of these are big challenges. I'm not saying on-site auditing can't be done. I think a good auditor will address and will overcome those kinds of challenges. Likewise, off-site work that we do in itself is not a panacea. So if monitoring partners that we work with, again, they're local civil society organizations, if they simply were to go to factory gates and say, hey, can you talk to me, without knowing the workers or without any kind of preparation, that approach would also fail. Mostly workers would not talk to them. So the importance here is to in our methodology is to combine this offsite approach with strategies to build trust. And those strategies vary. Often our monitoring partners approach workers through trusted networks. It can be through trade union contacts. It can be through community networks. It can even be through faith networks. So that's one approach. One thing that's very common is for our monitoring partners actually to provide support and services to workers. So they don't go to the workers just to get information from them. They develop an ongoing relationship. For example, education on your rights. What are your rights by law? What's occupational health and safety? Is your workplace safe? All trainings like that are often very appreciated. One of our monitoring partners actually runs a shelter for migrant workers. So of course that's an opportunity for intensive interaction and building of trust. Another one of our monitoring partners has developed an app that functions as a grievance mechanism, but also provides health and safety information, also provides legal advice to workers. And in some cases, monitoring partners actually have a physical presence in their communities. So all this is a foundation for good monitoring. And I think in terms of what companies can do, absolutely, companies can, and they do already, I know, approach these civil society organizations. And if you haven't done that, I think if you haven't traveled to where your products are being made and met the local organizations, it can be a real eye-opening experience. And I think that it is absolutely worthwhile to have the dialogue with local civil society organizations to understand workers' perspectives better. But in addition to that, and maybe even more important from a company, I'd say look for opportunities to engage legitimate trade unions. I'm not saying that the company should go to a trade union and say, hey, come here and organize this factory. That would not be very appropriate. But companies and trade unions can have dialogue. Even if it doesn't lead to big agreements, they can have dialogue. And this is important not just for companies and trade unions to learn from each other, but it also sends a critical message to workers that, okay, these companies talking to these trade unions, okay, my company is not looking, or the buyers of my company is not looking at trade unions as the enemy. And that inspires them with some confidence too, that they are free to organize and exercise their rights. So I think those are a couple of things perhaps for companies to do.
Yeah. Yes, thank you for that. And I think you mentioned something very important at the beginning, but the essence sort of stayed throughout your statement, the word trust. So I think we have approached also before in our webinars how to set up grievance mechanisms, right? And we have had companies and MSIs here present how, to follow the steps, but that's quite technical and quite theoretic. And in reality, I think a lot of companies face the issue of not having the engagement of workers. And one may say, okay, sectors like the textile sector face the issue of having a myriad of grievance mechanisms. That can be one issue, but I think at the very foundation part of why grievance mechanisms may not succeed is simply the lack of trust with workers. So I know that this is not easy. This is something that I say it sounds easy, but it is not. So
No.
Engagement with workers can be particularly difficult for companies who try to do this further down in their supply chain. And Electronics Watch has a model to facilitate worker dialogue and identify priority issues. And you have touched upon it a little bit with the approach of your local partners. Could you describe how that works a little bit more in detail and how companies can collaborate with organizations such as Electronics Watch more concretely?
I mean, if I can, you highlighted the question of trust, and there are many ways, to build trust. I think I highlighted one in my earlier answer: build dialogue with legitimate local trade unions. That's one thing. If you're operating a grievance mechanism, what will inspire trust is if those grievance mechanisms actually deliver results for workers. If a worker actually uses it, maybe there aren't very many workers who use it in the beginning, but if it's only a few workers use it in the beginning, they get an immediate response. Workers are kept up to date. They see how the companies are working on these issues. Companies solicit their input, and in the end, there's impact. There's a result. That process will help to create trust as well. I want to say, I want to go back to these barriers to worker participation that I mentioned in the beginning too, because this is maybe one of the most important things for companies to do, to address those barriers. All companies cannot address all barriers, but look, if you see that any kind of worker coercion, if you see that anybody in your company or in another company or maybe a recruitment agency is subjecting workers to coercion, saying, don't talk to auditors, don't have tolerance for that. Hold those accountable. So do not tolerate worker coercion. That's number one. Do not tolerate any kind of union busting or discrimination against union members or interference in the legitimate process of organizing. If workers see that my company or the buyers of my company is supporting me to organize, that will inspire confidence, that will build trust. And I would also say this may be more of a challenge because it's a legal hurdle for many companies. But find ways, to share, to be transparent, and share what the audit findings, share what you know about the factories where workers are employed that you think that workers should actually know about themselves. You may not be able to actually share the actual audit report because that's legally protected data, but you can find other ways to be transparent, I think, based upon the audit report. So I think those are some ways, I think, for companies to build trust among workers. And when you build trust among workers, then you will also be able to, workers will also come forward. They will share things with companies that they typically do not share. Normally what we see in the audit process typically is very good at finding if there are violations in wage and hours, or if there are occupational health and safety violations, or there's some problems with management. These are things that you can find physical records that reflect these kind of violations. Typically in audit, most audits are not so good at uncovering issues relating to workers' fundamental rights regarding freedom of association, forced labor, and so on. But the more you build trust with workers, the more you address these barriers, the more your audits will also be able to uncover these issues. Yeah.
Maybe I can also place a question, because I've heard this also in conversations with different sectors. I think achieving this sort of impact is also based on the relationships that are being had between buying companies and supplying companies, right? And I've heard many times of the intricacies of the electronic sector or the automotive sector. We don't speak of supply chains, we speak of supply networks. It's very difficult for buying companies to establish trust-based relationship with all suppliers. But we are here pleading, for companies to build trust within the supply chain with workers. So what would be your take on this? How can buying companies be successful at achieving it with the constraints that their sectors may face?
Well, I think that there is ongoing work in this area. I think that the buying companies, do sometimes provide trainings to their suppliers. I think that to the extent that those trainings actually can involve again local trade unions, can involve local civil society organizations, can involve organizations in which workers already have some trust, they will be more effective. So trainings is one aspect. Again, accountability is another one. If there is any kind of union busting, if there's any kind of, if workers face reprisals, set a zero tolerance limit for that, or don't immediately respond to that. That's one thing. Another thing I think is important for buying companies is to often the brands or the buyers will jointly buy from the same suppliers, same factories. Create a coordinated approach. So if you're one of 4 or 5 companies that buy from the same suppliers, then approach those other suppliers and to see if you can have a common dialogue with. Approach those other buyers to see if you have a common dialogue. There are obviously vehicles for you to do that. There are organizations that help facilitate that, but that's really important. So combined leverage, take accountability seriously, and do trainings together with trusted partners to workers. I think that those are 3 pieces of advice. Yeah.
Oh, thank you for that. And I think if our audience can, remember a little bit of the input that was said in previous webinars, this is one of the key messages that has always been said, right? So there has to be more industry engagement and ways for buying companies to come together and seek leverage where they don't have it.
And I would say also, look, this goes to the whole new dialogue that we're having on due diligence, right? Whose responsibility is it to exercise due diligence? It has to be a shared responsibility, and no company can outsource this responsibility to any kind of external association, or just say that you're exercising due diligence because the suppliers told you that there are no problems. Be active. Take responsibility. Don't outsource due diligence. Yeah.
Thank you for that. That's a perfect segue also to my last question, because these webinars as well have been set up taking into consideration the mandatory HREDD law that has gained momentum right in the last years. So I would like to ask you this question. So the CSDDD, the EU directive on corporate sustainability, foresees a concrete and clear role for civil society. Do you think that Electronics Watch role will change after the directive begins enactment?
Well, if I had a crystal ball, would be great. But what I will say is that I think this is a really interesting period for us to do this work. There is not just a due diligence directive on the European level. There's, of course, all the supply chain laws and due diligence legislation in many countries in Europe. But there's also the modern slavery legislation in the UK, and in Australia, there's similar legal initiatives that target forced labor, and in the US and in Canada. And there is all kinds of discourse and action and research surrounding all these legislative initiatives that I think has the potential to produce a paradigm shift in the way in which supply chain actors address rights violations in supply chains. By this, I mean a paradigm shift basically from where companies are the center of the process, where companies' needs and perspectives are central, to where workers and the rights holders are at the center of the process. So let me explain a little bit what I mean here. So today, I think we have corporate-driven due diligence. I'm not saying that this is not a good thing to do, but look, the core objective, and I think it's fair to say, is in corporate-driven due diligence is to protect companies against reputational risk. We have a growing ESG, environmental social governance, risk management industry that's designed to meet the growing market for what's called business assurance, so supply chain assurance. But the problem is that providing assurance, that we're managing these risks adequately, is not necessarily the same thing as adequately addressing workers' rights or needs and priorities. So that's first. And so the process and outcomes in corporate-driven due diligence is determined by companies, as we have discussed. The audit and the follow-up process of the timelines is driven by companies, and there are often long delays here from workers' perspective. Company may think, okay, we are doing this precisely good according to schedule, but that is not workers' perspective for the most part. Again, and then responsibility here is often pushed down the supply chains towards the supplier, towards the employer, rather than shared among supply chain actors. So that's, I think, if I could paint a broad picture, the current model. There are, of course, divergences from this. There are, of course, good practices here too. And nothing of this is to say that the auditing and corrective action process shouldn't continue. But in addition to this, we now have, I think, momentum towards worker-driven due diligence. And so what we see, not just in the legislation and the guidance documents, but also in all the discourse and all the action surrounding it, is that a core objective is also shifting towards protecting workers against risk of harm and providing remedy. That's the core objective. That should be the core objective, I believe. We're seeing expectations that workers have to have access to a credible complaint process, that there has to be meaningful stakeholder engagement, including with workers, to determine a corrective action, to determine prevention and remedy. And again, we have this powerful concept of remedy, I think, as distinct from corrective action, where corrective action is okay, a company, that is violating worker rights needs to stop violating worker rights, needs to comply with the law. In addition to that, now we're asking the question, well, how were workers harmed by that violation, and how should they be compensated? How should they be made whole? That's a very powerful idea, I think. So we have there's momentum towards this idea, and also now we're beginning to ask the question of shared responsibility. There's renewed attention to purchasing practices, to business models, to cost sharing. Who should actually pay for this? Who has responsibility? Those are really powerful questions, I think. So there is that possibility for this paradigm shift. I don't think anything is preordained. Due diligence can still become a failure, I guess. Yeah, it can become a pro forma checklist based upon poor data, poor evidence that doesn't result in much impact for workers. But I think we have the window of opportunity also for something much more meaningful. So I'm optimistic about that.
Yes, thank you for that last message of reassurance, thinking positively of the future and what HREDD law may bring upon corporate responsibility and the improvement of worker rights. So thank you very much, Björn. We will move to our next speaker. I think we have learn in a nutshell what Electronics Watch does, and hopefully the companies present in the call will be able to extract a couple of golden nuggets out of your answers and how to integrate worker voices into companies' global supply chains. Of course, we have a Q&A section after our next speaker. Thus, for the audience, please feel free to leave questions in the chat for Björn or for Electronics Watch. I saw there's already a couple of them there. Now on to our second guest, the Director for Automotive and Aerospace Industries at IndustriAll Global Union, Georg Leutert. Georg, a warm welcome to you too. Could you please start by introducing yourself and the work you do for IndustriAll?
Yes, good morning, and thank you very much, Maria. So my name is Georg Leutert, and I'm the Director for Automotive and Aerospace Industries. That's what you just said. In IndustriAll Global Union is a global trade union federation representing about 50 million workers in about 140 countries around the globe. And we have roughly 600 affiliates representing workers in mining, energy, and all of the manufacturing industry. So manufacturing then also includes my two sectors. And what's my main job? I mean, my main job is to look after the sector, really a very traditional sector policy, looking after my unions in the sector, and then, of course, also having quite close relations with a lot of the main players, so the main OEMs in these two sectors. But I mean, we now already look a lot into new fields of activities which are more cross-sectorial. This, of course, includes the hot topic of human rights due diligence and everything which relates to supply chains. We particularly look at this right now into battery supply chains because it's such a hot and big topic, and as we represent workers along this supply chain, it is a pretty attractive thing for us to do, and this is where we invest a lot. I guess this is kind of a short overview. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Georg. So now diving into the topic for today, which is integrating worker voices into remedy and grievance mechanisms. My first question would be, what role do unions play in theory in creating access to remedy for workers? And how does this role play out in reality? And also, please, if you could highlight challenges and areas of opportunity based on your opinion.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I mean, we receive complaints or cases of violations of workers and trade union rights, like maybe not on a daily basis, but certainly on a more than a weekly basis from around the globe in our different sectors. And so we have been dealing with these cases for a very long time, and we'll continue to do so because our affiliates and the workers, they trust that we can support them either by our access to the companies, particularly the OEMs, and where we then if it's an OEM, then we'll deal with the OEM. If it's a supplier, we'll of course try to look into the supplier situation through the OEM, because the affiliates can normally tell us to what company the supplier ships their products to. And the other thing is, of course, if that all doesn't help, or if there is no solutions in dialogue or so, then we, of course, also willing to campaign publicly or put an article on our website. We'll always write letters. So this is what we've been doing for a long time. The other aspect is, of course, through collective bargaining and also through some global agreements that we have with some OEMs. We often you of course also try to influence the companies directly and have a dialogue with them on their supply chain procedures. We try to sensitize them for certain countries and certain areas. We train them. We train people on the ground, but we also train the OEMs or also the suppliers if possible. So there are lots of areas where we try to interact, and I guess our main challenge right now is that the spotlight is very much on, of course, on human rights due diligence right now, also due to the new legislation and the upcoming legislation in Europe. But we see the focus is very much on forced labor, child labor, a lot of environmental aspects. It's on indigenous people, etc., etc. That's all good, fair. I mean, and we appreciate that actually there is so much more awareness of this now, but we also see that there are some core items for us are rather freedom of association. So for workers, the right to establish a trade union and then to enter in collective bargaining. And we have the feeling this appears on the list, but is not. It doesn't get the priority it should have from our point of view. And this is particularly true in the field of risk analysis. So we see there's a lot going on in risk analysis, but these topics are rather left out or not so prominent. And this is a problem because, of course, our mechanism is through our workers and through our trade union affiliates or those who want to become a trade union. And if they don't have a chance to act as a trade union, if there's no dialogue, if there is no bargaining, then everything's lost. So last sentence, we had cases where we were pretty successful, I would say, in cooperating with the compliance department of a certain company. And maybe even the company finally lost their sourcing with the OEM because we could prove that things are really bad at the supplier. But at the same time, they were successful in their union busting activities, so the union was gone. And then this is, of course, a disaster for us because, yeah, it's like a pyrrhus victory, if you want.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for highlighting those issues and the gaps that you see also vis-a-vis the new legislation. However, I mean, you did mention one tool, which is the tool which I would like you to elaborate on in just a second. So the global framework agreements, I would assume that these are exactly tools where you could anchor such topics, right? Like freedom of association and living wages to a certain extent. So can you maybe go into those framework agreements a little bit more? And can you introduce the idea and give concrete examples of how this can work in practice, taking into consideration that a lot of our audience members are buying companies? Exactly. And what is the overall experience of IndustriAll with GFAs?
Yeah, first of all, this is quite an old instrument already, and I think it has developed quite a bit. So, I mean, in the beginning, it was really to defend the major ILO core conventions, and then they have developed into larger agreements normally, which go further than this, and where, of course, and this is work that where we got stronger over the years, I would say, is all the part of the monitoring, because as I said before, when first of all there is a lot of training and that is required, particularly on the ground, of local management, but also of headquarter management, to know exactly what these ILO convention means, because sometimes they're, I mean, they're partly quite old conventions, like coming, I mean, they're from after the Second World War or so. And of course, people don't, I mean, they read these very short documents but they don't read all the recommendations about it. They don't read all the policy that has been developed based on these core conventions or fundamental conventions over the past decades. So there is a lot of work to do on this. But then secondly, when a violation comes up, so then our experience in the past was always that it took so long to get these cases going. So whatever, reported about a supplier in a certain country who sacked all their workers who affiliated to a trade union. And then, of course, we bring up the case, we give a description, and then it takes normally far too long until we get together with the OEM, like with the compliance department, with procurement, whoever is concerned, with HR or legal or so. It just simply takes too long. That's our experience from the past, and this is what was always difficult. And then there are some countries where the labor legislation is pretty weak. But at the same time, you had very strong actors on the ground defending the system. So this is the case, for instance, in the US, where you get very low, I mean, where labor legislation is really pretty weak and not really pro-union at all. And then what happens is that the company will tell you, well, we're okay to defend our global framework agreement everywhere on the globe, but not in the US. We can't. The reality is simply too anti-union. So this is one of the major issues we're having. But on the other hand, I mean, the positive side of the GFAs is really now, I mean, with the majority of the companies, after some years, we always get into, a better working together. And I mean, and now also with the legislation and with all the new personnel that you can see in compliance department, things are actually improving and accelerating. And so we can say that we can actually solve quite a number of cases by now really getting people quickly together by by making sure the company is really following up, and there are procedures and et cetera, and they take our input and then they understand our input more. So that's quite okay, and that is quite helpful. But yeah, it's not always working, as I said. But it's still quite a good instrument, also because we're dealing here with a company, but like we do in collective bargaining, so really insiders into the company, and we're having direct contacts, and so that is also important. We're not like just an outside partner or like an outside NGO or so making a complaint. We know the workers, and we do have partners already through existing collective agreements, so that sometimes or very often makes things actually far easier.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. However, you did mention something quite crucial, and where I would like to ask also my next question regarding the maybe countries or regions where there's a shrinking space for trade unions and worker representation, legitimate worker representation. So maybe not just the US, but there are also many other countries in Asia or maybe sometimes in Eastern Europe. So here, regarding those cases, is there any advice that you could give to buying companies? How can they encourage or promote the engagement with legitimate representation in such landscapes? So where civil society or legal protection of local trade unions is lacking.
Yeah, I mean, there are, of course, some very extreme cases, like in Myanmar, where we, for instance, make a big campaign, or have been making a big campaign around the textile company and asking them to exit the country, because this was what our affiliates on the ground said, like, you can't support this regime, and you got to make sure, even if it costs jobs, we want the international companies to leave the country. This is the only way we can protest and maybe get back to democratic structures again. So the same is probably true for Belarus and some other countries. So these are very extreme cases where we also then have to go for quite extreme measures. There are other cases where indeed the space is shrinking. I mean, it's sometimes shrinking, and then, I mean, of course, with another government, it can also grow again, right? But Tunisia is a good example. For instance, after this, the new president was elected, and then he closed down the parliament and everything. So, and I mean, don't forget, the union was actually the spearhead of the Arab Spring in Tunisia, so a very important player. And now their space of maneuver is shrinking dramatically. So this is really something where and what. I mean, and there are other countries, like certainly also partly in Morocco or Malaysia or in Thailand. Thailand is also a difficult case. So there are several countries, you're right. I mean, the main thing in these countries where things are not as weird as I said in Myanmar is mainly that we try to get in contact with the companies and try to explain and sensitize them for the situation, and so that they do not fall into the same trap. And then also limit the space for unions in their companies, because this, we think, is it normally is an important instrument to defend, at least if it's not working in the public sphere anymore so much, but at least to protect the workers inside the companies. And inside the companies, they are actually also quite powerful. I mean, normally they are ways and strategies to defend workers, to defend collective bargaining, to defend the union inside the company. And then this, of course, has a larger effect on the country too. So I think this is the main thing. And then, of course, I mean, we try to support our unions whenever they go public, whenever they go for demonstrations, etc. We, of course, share the news on our website and make everybody aware. And yeah, I think that's really the main thing. And if there's, and then, of course, through networking, we can, of course, also sometimes help unions in such a delicate situation, try to find some best practice examples, try to create some solidarity movements so that these colleagues also know they're not alone, and maybe they can team up with others who are in a similar situation or who were in a similar situation before, and so they learn from each other. I guess that's mainly what we can do. But overall, pretty difficult if it comes to these situations. But, and final remark, we often make the experience that companies are not so much aware of this. We had just recently a debate with some German auto companies on India, where we found out they were not aware of the shrinking spaces. They were not aware of what's really going on. And they didn't see this link also between the shrinking space and their human rights due diligence policy. It's exactly what I said before. These labor rights topics, the basic ones, are not a priority in many risk analysis procedures in big companies, and that's a major problem.
This is, however, a very huge role, right, that trade unions and also local ones take on advocacy and lobbying, right, for workers. Are there any synergies that you could see also with, for example, NGOs? You know, we had a conversation with Björn from Electronics Watch just now. So is there any complementarity that you could see here in this role?
Absolutely, and we are actually in regular contact also with Electronic Watch and also with other NGOs. So yeah, there are lots of ways how to cooperate. On the other hand, we also have to make sure. I mean, there are so many NGOs out there, so we don't have the resources really also to work with everybody. So what we do is we try to come up with some strategic alliances with some major NGOs in our sectors, in our work, but not with everybody, certainly. And then, of course, we also cooperate a lot in some multi-stakeholder initiatives, like the Global Battery Alliance, or like IRMA, or many, but I think there are at least 5, 6, 7, 8 others, where we also cooperate closely, and where, of course, the NGOs are close partners to us. And the other player, of course, that becomes more and more important is investors who are looking after, I mean, kind of socially responsible investors. So there is also more and more ties that we see, and where we also see that we can gain a lot of strength from them, because they are pretty quick. I mean, we know they're checking our website every day. And so if we partner with them, then we know that this has quite an immediate effect on companies. But on the other hand, I mean, this is sometimes also a bit of an instrument of last resort, because we are more, of course, oriented towards dialogue and bargaining. So we always try to find a solution here first before we go public and go for blame and shame, if I may say that this way. But yeah, NGOs are very important, and yeah, Electronic Watch is one of our major partners, actually.
Yes, thank you for that. And this takes me actually to our last question, which I also posed to Björn from Electronics Watch. So we have talked about the upcoming EU level legislation on human rights due diligence. So the CSDDD, as it's being called, foresees a concrete and clear role for civil society. How does this complement the work that trade unions do in producing countries? And I'm going to highlight that Björn mentioned that this new legislation poses a paradigm shift in a positive direction. What would your opinion be here?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we see that I would say this whole legislation around human rights due diligence, and I think the European legislation, hopefully it will really come in place pretty soon, is certainly the highest level, or the best practice that we can see. Yeah, that because for us, as I said, our first pillar of action is clearly everything which is around the ILO core conventions and some other instruments, which were mainly voluntary instruments, right? And then our second pillar is clearly our company policy, global framework agreements, any global networks based on companies, etc. And now we really see clearly a third pillar emerging, which is around human rights due diligence. And we can already see the big progress made since then. We see that on company side, there is far more resources. There are now clear procedures. Things are really speeding up. There's far more awareness for our topics, etc., etc. So the legislation is absolutely helpful for us, and therefore we also a big defender and promoter of the European directive, because if the European directive also, I mean, is in place, and once it is ratified by all the member states, I mean, there'll be little to no company that will be really able to escape from this, right? So there will be quite a global coverage. And so this is super, super important. And these petty kind of things, like a bit of legislation here, a bit of voluntary here, a bit of company here, a bit of that, will hopefully come together. And we guess it'll make our work also far easier, as we maybe don't have to focus that many resources on the individual company anymore, but we can maybe broaden it and have a more global approach on this. And I think this will be helpful for us in many ways. And then knowing that this legislation includes also trade unions, like in Germany, also there are some elements where works councils and worker representatives are clearly involved, where unions could take a case to court in Germany for somebody else. Like, we see that there is also importance given to trade unions, which is of utmost important to us. So I guess it's really an important step forward, and yeah, let's hope it'll really become a game changer. But right now we're also quite optimistic about this.
Yes, thank you. I think this is then so far the message that we have received from both you and from Björn from Electronics Watch, that this could be a game changer and will probably make your jobs way easier. But of course, at the end of the day, what we all want is improved worker rights, right? And this will help leverage these rights, hopefully. So we all remain optimistic on this. Thank you very much, Georg, for your answers. And let's move on to our Q&A.
Thank you.
So there are 2 questions in the chat. I can read both of you first. The first one, do you have any experience with using digital tools or digital service to surface issues from workers directly? And if yes, do workers trust this?
Excuse me. Yes, some experience we do have, and so we have monitoring partners that use mobile phone apps to survey workers and to elicit complaints from workers. I think that so again, it's not as simple as saying, meeting workers at random and saying, look, here's this great tool, will you use the tool? It will not work that way. This is in the context of this particular monitoring partner has been working with electronics workers in their sector for several years. They have done, they have networks of workers already established. They do worker education, they meet them physically face to face. And it is in this context that they introduced this app, and are suggesting that this is an additional tool that they can use. So I think again, the context is very important here to elicit worker trust. On a whole different level, I also want to, I have not said anything about work in China yet, but this is also, it is of course a very challenging environment, both especially perhaps for worker-driven monitoring and for our approach, but it's also extremely challenging for regular social auditors right now who may sometimes find themselves under threat. So here, one of the sort of innovative approaches that we use is monitoring remotely workers' dialogue in public forums, where they may be expressing grievances about their particular factories. And this is possible. Workers speak quite explicitly about the issues that they face in factories. It is especially useful, I think, to where workers are part of larger factories, so you have the possibility of larger quantities of data. It is not the same as meeting face-to-face with workers and doing in-depth interviews, of course, but you can get some quantitative perspective on workers' priorities that way as well. And that certainly is something that is possible for companies to do as well. In addition to that, I think in China, in particular, if to the extent that audience members actually do production there. It is possible for companies to work with organizations that can introduce a app-based grievance mechanisms directly in a factory and have the factory actually endorse this to workers. Not all factories this would work in, but it's something that could be tried. Yeah, so that's that question.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for that, Björn. So there's a second question. How did Electronics Watch identify and come into contact with the specific CSOs? From my experience, some of them are very protective of the people they work with and are not willing to compromise their safety through working with an external party.
Yeah, that's also a good question. I think that well, the origin of Electronics Watch was with, we were actually founded by a coalition of NGOs in several European countries that worked on labor rights issues in Asia and in other parts of the world. So there were established networks with these CSOs in electronics production regions already when we were founded. So there were already networks of trust and cooperation there. So I think that we have benefited quite a bit from that. So our original relationship with monitoring partners in Asia and other places were through these pre-established networks. And what we then added to that is we have developed trainings in how they can do worker-driven monitoring systematically and consistently. So we trained them, and secondly, we have informed them about how to use this particular public procurement leverage to drive change. So they know they don't come to us with all issues that they face. Because they know we can address some issues, but not other issues. And sometimes they come with us with complaints and we say, look, we can't address that because we have absolutely no leverage here. So I think that it's a matter of long-term working relationships, investment in their work that leads them to develop the trust in us.
Thank you, Björn. I think you have a follow-up question to China. I don't know to which extent you can reply to this. Do you have any third-party vendor recommendations that provide worker apps in China or elsewhere?
Yeah, I'd rather not go into that in a public setting like this. But if this is somebody, if this person would like to contact me privately, I'd be happy to talk about that. This is, as people probably know, it is there's considerable risk for organizations that are seeking to address labor rights issues in China. The particular organization that we are working with, there's a couple of organizations that we're working with right now. They are relatively safe for their own particular reasons, their own particular histories, but they are very attentive to they know how to navigate the risk, but it's not, that doesn't mean that it's a risk-free environment, and we're not public about those relationships.
Thank you, Björn. Okay. I would like to thank Björn a lot for his insights. I think that the audience really resonated to the information that you gave us and your perspective on how to integrate worker voices. You did give a couple of very useful messages that I think I will also like to highlight. I think you gave a couple of messages on, for example, how remedy is a process, how also it is not solely about integrating worker voices, but also on reflecting on this and integrating it in the remedy process, and also in a wide HREDD strategy for companies, right? So not just leave it as the data that is coming in, but rather reflecting upon it. And lastly, you also highlighted that the mandatory HREDD law that's coming into force may be able to grant us a paradigm shift. I don't know about the wording, but I think it's a very optimistic view that we should definitely keep in our heads for the near future. And thank you.
And I hope that one of my core messages was actually that legitimate trade unions are essential to an effective remedy process. So I hope that came through too.
It did for sure. I think Georg would have been very glad to touch upon that as well. Okay. Anyway, so thank you, Björn. Thank you to the audience, and thank you to my collaborators from the Social and Economic Council. And thank you for joining. See you next time.